a sort of a cultural expectation, if you like. What are the worst things a Christian could do if they turn their back on God? And it's very much this kind of inversionary thinking. So if you don't, it's kind of the world turned upside down, if you like. So if you don't worship God, you must worship the devil. And you do all sorts of really horrendous things, like have all sorts of immoral sex, perhaps eat babies, so none of this is actually happening. I hasten to add, this is absolutely all fantasy, but it's a very, very powerful fantasy.
Alison Rowlands is a professor of European history at the University of Essex with specific interests in the early modern period, gender history, and witchcraft, which is what we're going to be discussing today. Professor Rowlands, welcome to Smart Cookies. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
You did a wonderful series of short lectures for Historical Association on the topic of early modern German witchcraft. And in the beginning of those, you said that witchcraft emerged from European popular culture in kind of like late medieval period. It emerged from people believing in magic, good and bad. But if we can stop here for a brief moment, what was magic exactly? Was it more of like a supernatural property or ability ascribed to just anything that couldn't be explained otherwise? Kind of like filling the gaps sort of thing? Or was it a bit more defined than that?
Yeah, I think it's both of those. I think it's absolutely central to how people at that time imagined their world. It was also a profoundly religious society. And so I think magic needs to be seen as part of that overall system. So people believe in God, in saints, but they also believe in the devil, in spirits, in the possibility really of, I guess we could call it, supernatural intervention in the world. So it's a very, very, very different mindset to the mindset that we have today. Most of us nowadays tend not to think that we're going to meet the devil when we go shopping, or that a familiar spirit is going to encounter us in our kitchen. And interestingly, we probably tend to laugh about those ideas now, but people then took them very seriously. And there was a very broad kind of division between sort of good or at least ambivalent magical power, but also there was the idea that you could actually do bad things with magic. So magic was really a power as well. Humans felt they could do magic, perform magical rituals to harm people, but also to find buried treasure, to cure people. So it wasn't just a negative power. It was believed to be possible to put it to good uses, to tell fortunes, to prophesy, and so on. The other thing I'd add, Zaza, is that it's not just popular culture. It's taken super seriously by the elites as well. So you actually have quite a few very well-educated men who would practice magic, necromancy, for example, to try and raise and control spirits to do certain things for them. So I think it's such a powerful belief because it's so widespread, and it's so important to the way people explain things and manage their lives.
You mentioned that people believed in supernatural intervention in their lives. Was that a regular occurrence? Did it happen like every day, or was it reserved for exceptional circumstances?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think there are exceptional circumstances in which it would happen, and certainly, in the context, say, of perhaps encountering a demon, that would be very, very exceptional, very unusual. But most people, on a fairly kind of day-to-day basis, would have used, for example, protective magic. They might have worn, an amulet around their neck, or they might have, blessed their cattle before taking them out in the morning to the fields. Or very often doorways are used as sort of protective mechanisms for people going in and out of houses, or livestock going in and out of barns. And you might put a symbol, for example, over your threshold or over your door as a protective mechanism. So there's a general sense in which magic was much, much more part of just the everyday, everyday life. It was very practical. If you're a 15th century peasant, lots of stuff can go wrong. You can get ill, your cows can die, the weather can be really bad. So you're very pragmatic. I think you would use whatever you can to try and kind of get through the day, get through the year, ensure you've got a good harvest and so on. It makes a lot of sense, really. And if you think doing a bit of good magic or protective magic is going to help, then it makes us. I'm sure we would have done it if we'd have lived then. I'm sure we would have done much the same.
Yeah, you said whatever gets you through the day, and that's why I still read the Zodiac.
Okay, there you go.
Because it helps me get through the day.
The continuity of belief. So that's a whole other story.
But on the other hand, if you were a 15th century peasant and every time you lost your pitchforks or whatever, you went, "Oh, the devil took them," or "I've been bewitched," or whatever, people would probably say, "Oh, get off it, mate. It's just you lost your pitchforks again.
Yeah.
You're clumsy, you're forgetful." You couldn't just claim that for everything. Probably there were some standards of ascribing what was witchcraft or what and what wasn't.
Absolutely. I mean, I think in the 15th century, the 15th century is really, really interesting, because what happens in the 15th century is that there was a big change in belief, but mainly on the part of the educated elites. So you've had, for a long time, broadly speaking, kind of general belief in good magic and bad magic, and in the possibility of people working magic. But what happens in the course of the 15th century is a really, really new idea emerges, which is that there's a new type of witch. And this is really the radical innovate. This is very innovative. This is very new. This hasn't been around before. And so what happens at the level of particularly religious elites is that they start to fear a new threat to Christianity, a new heresy, and they begin to think not just that a witch could work harm by magic, but also that witches are in league with the devil, that witches are a new form of heresy, and that's really what changes. It changes the way people believe about witchcraft, but I think it changes the level of fear of witches. So the witch is no longer imagined as someone in a village who could work magic, but it gets elevated in some of this elite thinking to someone who can work magic, but is also in league with the devil, plotting with other witches and the devil, and it kind of elevates the threat of witchcraft onto a whole new level. And that really, I think, is what explains to some extent the witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries. It's this new, very new idea that witchcraft is a new heretical threat, and that's why the church elites, secular elites, why do they take it so seriously? Well, they take it so seriously at this time in history in Western Europe, particularly because of this very new idea in witchcraft as a new threat, a new heretical threat to the church.
We're going to come back to the early modern period, but just to go back just a little bit, just to illustrate how stark this change is, and please correct me if I say anything stupid here, but from my limited understanding, a lot of early Christian doctrine regarded witchcraft as superstition. It actually went so far that certain Christian rulers, such as Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor, I just read this, I don't know if it's right, that he outlawed burning witches at the stake because it was considered pagan. In fact, if you did that, you yourself would end up being killed. So could you talk more about why did this religious dogma change so dramatically?
No, I think you're right. That there is in the Middle Ages, it was still possible to be executed for witchcraft if it was believed that you'd try to kill somebody through image magic, for example, or through sort of poisoning someone. Then obviously you could still be executed for harmful magic. But there was much more of an emphasis on belief in witchcraft as a superstition. There's a very famous early 10th century church decree. It's called the Canon Episcopi, and it basically talks about people believing in magic, still believing in the goddess Diana and people flying about with the goddess Diana through the air, but what it says is that people who believe this are superstitious. Actually, it's a bit worse than that. They are actually technically idolatrous. They're breaking the first commandment because they're believing in false gods by believing this. But the interesting thing is, well, I think there are two really interesting things. The first one is there's much more of an emphasis on this as a kind of a spiritual problem. It's kind of a wrong belief rather than anything. And the other important thing is that the remedy for it is to try and teach people better Christian doctrine. It's not that they're all going to be carted off to be executed. So, ultimately, you could be excommunicated if you stuck to these idolatrous beliefs. But it frames ideas about witchcraft, magical flying, these sorts of things as being a spiritual problem, which could be and should be solved not through prosecution, not through execution, but through better education. So actually, I think you're absolutely right, Zaza. The Middle Ages, often people say, "Oh, the medieval witch burnings," but actually,
right, yeah.
The Middle Ages were relatively, and I use that term very advisedly with the annoying fingers, but relatively sort of restrained in relation to belief about witchcraft. What changes? I think various things change in the later Middle Ages. You have the massive plague epidemic of the 14th century, which I think just makes people much, much more anxious, concerned about mortality, concerned about who's causing and spreading diseases. There are actually some sort of various groups in society get there are some sort of accusations against Jews, some against lepers. This idea that there's a secret underworld plotting against Christian society, that's accentuated by the plague epidemic. You also get massive real heretical movements in the late Middle Ages, the Cathars, the Waldensians. So again, the Christian church is really under threat from heresy, particularly in the late Middle Ages. And you also get a slight change in terms of how people think about demons and the devil, particularly as a result of, for example, writers like Thomas Aquinas, that there's much more of a sense in some of this theological thinking from sort of the 12th, 13th century onwards, that this demonic threat is a physical, real one, rather than it being a kind of a mental, spiritual one. There's the idea that it's actually much more of a real threat. And then just to go back to the 15th century, what happens in the 15th century is that inquisitors are sent by the Pope to investigate heretics, to try and bring them back to the church. And we have several Dominican inquisitors, particularly going into the Alpine regions, into sort of southern Germany, and they're looking for heretics. They're looking for Waldensians, particularly real heretics, as the church would have it.
Excuse me, I have to stop you here. I don't know what Waldensians are.
Yeah, they are a heretic.
Is that like Cathars?
Yes, very similar to Cathars. Yeah. So these are two very significant heretical movements. So they are genuine movements where fairly ordinary people in some cases are critical of the church. Want things changing, and they are perceived as a real problem for the Catholic Church, and so they expend a lot of effort and energy in prosecuting them and in effectively suppressing them. But I think it raises their anxiety, the Church's anxiety about the threat of heresy. So when inquisitors go out in the 15th century as part of this heretic fighting program, they encounter people in villages, on mountainsides, who have lots of what they regard as really strange beliefs about magic, magical powers, magical flying, the possibility of harming people through magic. And what they do, and it's quite a long, complicated process in the 15th century, but what they do in the context of these sort of cultural encounters, if you like, between Dominican inquisitors and ordinary people, the Dominicans begin to think that these magical beliefs are part of this are a new sort of heresy. And you can actually see the idea emerging in some of the 15th century writings. These Dominicans, these churchmen, write about Waldensians, this heretical group, and then they begin to write about Waldensian witches. You can kind of almost see this,
the logical progression
exactly,
of their
yeah.
arguments, quote unquote. Yeah.
But the way that we can tell it's different is because they emphasize the power to do magical harm, and they also say that this new sect has the power of magical flight. So it kind of reframes that earlier idea of night flying as a superstition to a real kind of marker of this sort of new heresy. And that's really what the 15th century is really, really important, really interesting, because without that change, without that new idea of witchcraft as a heresy, a new heresy, another heresy that the church is feeling threatened by, I don't think, we wouldn't have had the scale of persecution that we get in the early modern period. You need that shift of emphasis. So witches are now not just people who can do harm, which is kind of scary enough, but they're also in league with the devil. It's kind of a new conspiracy theory, if you like, this unseen kind of threat.
Cabal.
Yeah.
Interesting. I interviewed, one of the first interviews I did on this podcast was with Dr. Delphi Nieto Isabel. I know she's a scholar of female mysticism in medieval Europe. Mm-hmm. And during the conversation, we also touched on witch trials a little bit. And she said something I was totally not expecting. She said that if a woman was accused of witchcraft, that was the medieval period, of course, by her community, the best chance she had was running straight to the nearest inquisitor. Because at least these men were educated enough to know that no woman can walk through walls or fly around, because these powers were reserved for God alone. So in most cases, she would end up getting acquitted. But that was earlier, right? You're talking about 15th century inquisitors on the hunt for heresy.
Yeah.
But it's still, again, it's quite dramatic how things change, even within the Inquisition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Although I should say that actually, although a lot of this sort of a lot of the change in terms of this idea can be linked to Dominican inquisitors in the 15th century, the vast majority of the trials that happen sort of from the late 15th to the 18th century, they're virtually all done by secular courts, not by the Inquisition, not by church courts. So what happens is this idea of witchcraft as a threat and as a heresy, it kind of gets taken up by the godly rulers of early modern states, and that's another. So in the same way that the idea that witch trials were kind of a medieval thing, that's a myth. And another kind of myth is that witch trials were the work of the Inquisition. I think the inquisitors, particular inquisitors in the 15th century, are really important in terms of developing this new idea. But they call on secular rulers to take up the fight, as it were. And because, most early modern states are really kind of theocracies, they're godly states, and religion is absolutely central to them. It's the secular elites, that they pass laws, they pass statutes against witchcraft. So it's very much a secular, legal persecution. So even though it has obviously very, very significant links to religion, it's actually driven forward by secular courts.
I think most of us have this image of Inquisition from popular culture. Like, I remember the movie In the Name of the Rose. Mm-hmm. It's based on a novel by Umberto Eco. And the Inquisition just rolls in with those scary kind of half-bald haircuts. And then they just start burning everybody. And then that's it.
Yeah.
Everybody gets burned at the stake. And they Yeah, they press their scary caravan onwards. You don't hear, or secular courts are just not depicted that often in popular culture. I think probably because they're less scary in the popular imagination.
Probably, yeah. No, I think it's a really interesting point, Zaza. It shows how much our perceptions are shaped by film and books and kind of TV and so on. Yeah, I mean, I think probably, some of the 15th century inquisitors, somebody like Heinrich Kramer, the author of the Malleus, I can imagine he would have been pretty scary. And certainly I'm sure some of them were like that. But I mean, what inquisitors want to do is not, they don't really want to execute people at the end of the day. They really want people to return to the fold, if you like. So, and actually, the places, if you look at a map of early modern witch persecution, Italy and Spain, so places that are kind of really dominated still by inquisitions, that they have, and again I'm using my relatively term, they have relatively low numbers of witch trials and executions. In fact, the Spanish Inquisition from the early 17th century onwards is relatively skeptical about witch prosecution. So again,
Oh, really?
yeah,
I thought that was the scariest one, the
no,
Spanish one, with
no,
Torquemada and,
mm-mm.
driving out all the Jews and flames
Possibly, well,
everywhere engulfing.
yeah. I mean, maybe they were less concerned about witches because they were too taken up with persecuting other groups. But certainly in terms of actual witch trials, they're again, on the comparative scale, Spain, Portugal, Italy have relatively few witch trials and certainly relatively few executions.
So once they crystallized, as you outlined right now, these beliefs about witches and witchcraft and what witches can do, what were these beliefs? Why are witches flying around and cavorting with the devil? I mean,
well, some of the ideas are just common to what the Christian Church has always thought about heretics. So there's a way in which Christianity tends to assume, what's the worst thing that a Christian could do? Well, worship the devil, obviously, harm Christians. So there is a kind of set of central beliefs that get projected onto several heretical groups. You could take it all the way back to things like the Knights Templar. So there's a sort of a cultural expectation, if you like. What are the worst things a Christian could do if they turn their back on God? And it's very much this kind of inversionary thinking. So if you don't, it's kind of the world turned upside down, if you like. So if you don't worship God, you must worship the devil. And you do all sorts of really horrendous things, like have all sorts of immoral sex, perhaps eat babies, so none of this is actually happening. I hasten to add, this is absolutely all fantasy, but it's a very, very powerful fantasy. What's different about the witchcraft, the things that really make it obviously different are, first of all, this idea of magical flight. That's really, really new. So these long-standing popular beliefs in the possibility of magical flying, which most people nowadays probably immediately think of Harry Potter and Quidditch. But anyway,
right.
At the time, it was a really kind of bizarre idea, and the Inquisitors thought this was what marked this new heretical group out as new. So the flying is new. The emphasis on the really kind of concerted acts of harmful magic is new. And the other thing that's quite new by the end of the 15th century is the idea that witches are more likely to be women, because up until then, heretics could be either men or women, or in fact were more likely to be men, actually. More of the heretical persecution sort of involved sort of either a reasonably even number of men and women, or they were more directed against men. So the things which make this new imagined sect of witches different is the magical flying, the magical use of harmful magic, but also the idea, the gendering of it, that it's more often in this belief system likely to be women who are witches. And the way you know this is because if you start prosecuting people and you ask them all sorts of leading questions and you pressure them and you probably torture them, your beliefs kind of get reaffirmed. So if you say to someone, you know, have you flown to a witches' gathering? And you make them say yes, that makes you think the witches' gathering was real. So a lot of the ideas kind of get expanded upon and confirmed for people by the actual trials. So they're kind of a set of ideas, if you like, on paper, but then if you introduce legal prosecution and you kind of get people to say stuff that you want them to, then that's a way of this belief system getting kind of strengthened and spread. I think the other important things to mention are, number one, technological change, because we get print emerging in the late 15th century. So I think, again, the speed and spread of these ideas is helped by print technology. We also have the Reformation happening in the early 16th century, so you get a lot of religious division, concern about godliness, desire. You know, a lot of states want to show how godly they are by persecuting people who aren't godly, and obviously witches could fit into that category. It's also a period that's known as the Little Ice Age. So there was we know from weather historians that particularly the 16th and 17th centuries are quite badly affected by very poor weather. So it's much kind of wetter and colder, and so harvests aren't so good. So there's kind of a general context of religious tension, bad weather, concern over resources, concern over food. So those sort of preconditions to make people more worried about their lives, their families, that can sort of feed into the making of witchcraft accusations as well.
You must have read a lot of original court transcripts and documents from that era. Mm-hmm. Could you take us through a typical witchcraft court case from the moment of presumably a woman was accused of being a witch to the moment
I think sorry, I was just going to say one of the problems is that the legal treatment of witchcraft is quite varied.
I see.
So we have the belief and we have laws against witchcraft, but if you looked at a map of early modern Europe, you'd see some areas which have really, really, really severe prosecution rates, and other parts of Europe where barely anybody is accused at all. So I think a really important point to make is that although there are laws against witchcraft and there are beliefs in witchcraft, the degree to which that translates into trials is very, very, very varied. It varies from region to region, and it changes a lot across time as well. So some parts of Europe have virtually no witch trials. Other parts of Europe have terrible witch trials. They might come in waves. They might come in patches. So I think there's a very, very variegated pattern in an area where people believe in witchcraft as a heresy, and they're very worried about witchcraft. Very often there would be a very short, very brutal trial. In other words, somebody would be questioned, very often tortured, and made to confess. They would be forced effectively to confess by the torture. But the other thing that they would often be forced to do, they would be asked, who else did you see at the witches' gathering? Who else did you see at the witches? So
denouncing others.
Yeah. So, or they were called witches' dances very often in German. So the problem with that mechanism, so if you have severe torture, really kind of concerted effort to get rid of witches, and a belief in the witches' Sabbath or the witches' gathering, that's where you've got that mechanism for rapid, brutal, and relatively large scale prosecution. Because if you denounce people, I mean, there's some records, for example, one person prosecuted in late 16th century Germany, I think they denounced 150 other people. So you kind of have this mechanism for spreading denunciations. So that's quite a different mechanism from one neighbour accusing another, say in a village here in Essex, which is more typical of, say, the English witch trials. You'd have a neighbour, perhaps whose child has died or fallen ill, who suspects someone in their community of having caused that illness. But there are also parts of Germany. I mean, I work bizarrely on a part of Germany that has relatively few witch trials. So one of the things I've been interested in doing in my own research has been to say, well, what stops these trials happening? What stops them escalating? Because I think there's a tendency perhaps for us to think everybody in the early modern period was always afraid of witches, was always wanting to prosecute them, was always willing to execute them. And actually, there are some parts of Europe where there's a lot less in the way of trials and prosecutions. So a lot depended where you were accused, a lot depended when you were accused. If you were accused in the context, say, of Bamberg in Germany in the late 1620s, you'd be caught up in one of these terrible, large-scale, brutal, rapid persecutions, and you'd probably have no chance whatsoever of surviving. You would confess and be executed, or you would probably die because the torture was so terrible. And something in the region of 600 people are executed in Bamberg in 4 years from, say, 1626 to 1630. If you were accused just up the road from Bamberg in the town that I work on, there are 3 executions in the whole of the early modern period. So you'd have a much, much better chance of being found not guilty, perhaps being just banished rather than executed, or not being accused in the first place. So, I think there's a very, very variegated pattern. It depends what the local courts want to do with accusations. So there's a lot of room for different legal authorities to sort of almost decide, are we going to run with this? I mean, again, we don't have the documents. They don't sadly leave us these nice texts where they say, we did this because. But there seems to me a sense in which some authorities really run with these trials, perhaps because they're being pressured to do so, perhaps because they want to do so. But other authorities are more kind of a little bit more careful about letting that genie out of the bottle, because it's quite hard once you've started, I think, to sort of stop.
Sounds remarkably like some sort of Stalinist show trial where people get presented with what they have to say in advance, and then it gets confirmed, obviously, because otherwise their family is going to get the worst of it. And of course, they're also beaten and tortured sometimes.
Yeah.
But why did prosecutors who were probably educated believe in torture? Obviously, they knew that people are going to say what they want them to say.
Well, in most of Europe at this time, torture is part of the legal system. So for example, in most of Central Europe, Germany, what was the Holy Roman Empire at the time? The law code which governs criminal prosecution allows for the use of torture, not just in witchcraft cases, but in all kind of serious cases. Now, it wasn't the case that everybody was tortured repeatedly. Even these very rudimentary law codes try to put some sorts of rules and regulations on the use of torture. So, for example, they'd say, you have to be accused by an honourable person. There has to be a certain amount of evidence against you. And also, the idea was that if you were tortured, say, mildly, if there could ever be such a thing. The first actual degree of torture was being shown the instruments of torture, which I don't know about you, Zaza, but that I would just confess. I would just see what was going on, and I would just sort of confess. So that was the first.
I would confess already when they would tell me that they're going to show me the instruments.
Yeah, exactly. But the idea was that if you maintained your innocence, your denial of guilt under torture, then unless there was any new evidence, you couldn't be tortured again. So it sounds very, very barbaric and very crude by our standards, but actually it was an attempt to regulate the use of these methods. So the really large-scale, rapid, brutal trials happen in parts of Europe, and particularly parts of Central Europe, Germany, where local authorities basically ignore these sort of overarching law codes. They treat witchcraft as what they call an exceptional crime. In other words, they think it's so bad, so ungodly, so threatening, that they basically throw the rule book out the window. I mean, it wasn't a great rule book to start with, but they effectively say anything goes in relation to witch trials, because they felt it was such a heinous crime. But your point's a really good one. I mean, people at the time know that people make false confessions. Some of the 17th century critics, I mean, it was quite risky to be a critic of witch persecution, but early modern people do recognise that the law is effectively forcing people to confess. So I think it's not by any means an objective legal system, because it's dealing basically with a non-existent crime. And, you know, if you're dealing with a non-existent crime, such as meeting the devil, going to a Sabbath, harming a child, destroying a harvest, you either believe in it and run with that belief, or you say, you know, we can't prove it. We really can't prove it at law. So in the area that I work on, the authorities, they believe in witches, the possibility of witches. They believe in the devil. But what they tend to say is, we don't want to execute an innocent person by accident. We don't want that on our conscience. So we will leave the judgment up to God. There's this really profound belief in God judging everybody when they're at the day of judgment. So some authorities think it's better to leave the judging to God, who can see and know everything, because witchcraft is such a secret, hidden crime. Their own legal systems can't reliably work out who's innocent and who's guilty. In other parts of Europe, the authorities think they've got, if you like, a bit more arrogance. They think they can find the witches, and the irony there is, what they say is the confessions prove this hidden demonic world. So you get in this horrendous loop of using false confessions to prove what you were trying to prove in the first. So I think once you start unpicking it with a modern kind of rational, logical approach, it just really doesn't make it was about what people wanted to believe, were willing to believe, and then what they were willing to do on the basis of that belief system. So you could believe in witchcraft but not want to prosecute people, or not want to really prosecute them very often. But in other parts of Europe, people ran with those beliefs, into very large scale persecutions. And if people tried to resist torture, they would say, well, the devil's helping them. They're only resisting the torture because the devil's on their side. And that was proof. So in a way, it was a catch-22 in those situations. You either admitted you were guilty, in which case you're a witch, or you resisted torture, in which case the devil was helping you and you were a witch. So again, in that situation,
fantastic choice.
Yeah. You would just probably be well advised to.
Could you ever get acquitted then, if you were caught up in a particularly vicious period, in a particularly vicious time, like in Bamberg, as you mentioned, you got caught up in this mass hysteria or whatever it was, and you were accused of being a witch? Was there any chance of you getting off the hook?
It's almost impossible. Almost impossible.
So they were basically like show trials.
Yeah, because as I say, any resistance, any attempt to not confess didn't stop. You would still be tortured again. That's why breaking the rule, breaking, sort of using torture excessively and repeatedly. So there's a very famous, a very famous case from Bamberg. A man called Johannes Junius, who's a man of sort of status, political influence, wealth. he's accused of witchcraft and taken to this specially built witch prison in Bamberg. And we have a letter that he wrote to his daughter that was never actually delivered outside the jail, so it survived amongst his trial documents. And it's a really interesting letter, because he basically says it's almost like he's realised for the first time anybody who goes into that witch prison will just be forced to confess because they can't withstand the torture. It's a very, very moving, harrowing letter, because he's trying to work through how, because he's going to perjure himself. You know, if you're a very good Christian, a very religious person, if you deliver a false confession, that's kind of a sin in and of itself. So he's trying to work through in this letter. He's saying, you know, I'm going to have to confess. I'm going to have to perjure myself, but I'm only doing it because they're making me. Now, we don't get these glimpses of that process very often, because obviously most of the accused can't write, can't read, and you know, there are some of these letters, but they're quite few and far between. But yeah, you had almost no chance of being acquitted in that context. What tends to end these sorts of trials is some sort of external intervention. So, for example, in Bamberg and Würzburg, you get the families of people who've been executed, you get them appealing to a sort of a higher level appeal court and asking for sort of external intervention on that score. Very occasionally, you get an absolutely stunningly resistant and resilient individual who just holds out for so long against the pressure, against the torture, that it begins. Once the prosecuting elites start to doubt what they're doing, that's usually what slows things down, brings things to an end. And you occasionally get people who resist the torture for so long that the prosecuting elites just begin to think, well, are we doing the right thing? Are we doing this properly? And in a way, I mean, it's very, very difficult for us, I think, and I don't think we should empathise with persecutors anyway, but I think the problem they have is once they've started one of these horrendous, brutal, cruel trial episodes, it's kind of, what do you do if you realise you've got it horribly wrong? I mean, you know, you say, you know, so what do you do? How do you you know, how do you go back on that if you've executed people? I mean, it's very interesting. In Salem, I don't know if you've heard of the Salem witch trials.
The American thing, right?
Yeah. In the late 17th century, what's really unusual about the Salem witch trials is that some of the men who were involved in the prosecutions and the convictions, they actually apologise afterwards. So, for example, the 12 men of the court jury who sat in the English and New English legal system, it was trial by jury. So you get the 12 jurymen of Salem apologising for what they did. But the explanation they give is really interesting. So they say they're really sorry about what happened and the fact that people got executed. But
everybody died,
but they were
really sorry about that.
Yeah, they were being deluded. They were being deluded by the devil. So it's not that they suddenly say the law was wrong, or gosh, you know, we've all become really rational or enlightened or anything. It's not to do with that. It's to do with the fact that they felt that the devil was manipulating all of the people to effectively cause discord, cause communities to get divided, and to execute innocent people, because, you know, at the end of the day, that's what the courts were doing. You know, these people, we know now, can't really work magic. They can't fly about on broomsticks. They can't have sex with demons. We know that now. So that they're effectively being executed for non-crimes in our eyes. But it's interesting that by the late 17th century, you know, there is that kind of realization that the law could actually have got things wrong. But again, it's part of that. The belief system is still so strong. The idea the devil was deluding people into executing the innocent.
Wow, the devil provided really handy excuses, like the dog ate my homework of the medieval era or the early modern period. You can always say, Oh, the devil made me do it.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. But it's interesting they felt the need. I mean, I think that shows what effect a witch trial could have on a community. I mean, it would have divided families. It would have, it would have caused poverty. People who are left behind if they've lost family, land. Even if, I mean, the vast majority of suspects in Salem are released without being executed, but they'll have been in jail for months. Even being in an early modern prison for any period of time, you could easily die of disease. Your farm and your house, it would all go to rack and ruin in your absence. So even not being convicted would have had a really profound impact on your life, on your livelihood. And I think that's, we tend to look at numbers of executions, and obviously rightly so, but there's probably a lot of the wider impacts, even in trials which don't end in conviction or execution. It would have had an absolutely horrendous impact on families, on people's reputations, on their livelihoods, and so on.
Speaking of the numbers of executions, do we have any idea of the total in the early modern period of how many people were executed? Because
yeah, I mean that's a really good question, because lots of very inflated figures have sort of entered some of the popular coverage of this topic. So you sometimes read of millions of women being executed, and I mean the academic historical figure is around sort of 50 to 60,000 executions, somewhere in the region of, say, 100 to 120,000 trials, about 50 to 60,000 executions. So
half of the people did get acquitted.
Yes.
Nevertheless.
Yeah.
Right. And what was the population of the entire
that's a very good
region,
question.
entire Western Europe at the time, approximately? Of course, it was changing.
I don't know off the top of my head, to my shame. But that's a really good question. I mean, there's been some really good work done by a historian called Wolfgang Behringer. He's got a really good book called Witches and Witch Hunts: A Global History, which is really great because it situates this early modern European witch hunting in a broader kind of global context. But the reason I really like that book, and I use it a lot when I'm teaching, is he looks at executions for witchcraft in early modern Europe, and he looks at the population totals of the individual countries. So he's doing exactly what you're suggesting, Zaza, which is that you've got to relate the total number of executions insofar as you can, because obviously the data isn't very precise, to the population of a particular region.
Right. Because I have no idea what, for example, early modern era France, how many people lived there? Was it 500,000? Was it 10 million? I have no idea.
I was going to say, if I had my Behringer table in front of me, I could.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah. I mean, these are very.
But what he does with that is he works out. So he's got the total number of executions for any particular region, but then he's got the per capita chance of being executed, if that makes sense. So
yeah.
And I think if memory serves, the early modern Germany has by far the highest number of total executions. It's 25,000. But I think if memory serves, the highest risk place to be to get executed as a witch was Liechtenstein, just because it's the relative, because it's a relatively small enclave, then the numbers relative to the overall, the numbers of executions relative to the overall population was quite significant. So for example, in the British context, England has a relatively low rate of prosecutions. There are something like 500 executions overall in England, which is fairly densely populated. The witch hunt in Scotland is more severe because you've got something like 1,500 at least executions in a much, much less densely populated area. So yeah, that's a slightly more nuanced way of thinking about it. So, I mean, all of those one execution is a very problematic thing. So I don't think. I mean, I think there's been some sort of feminist kind of emphasis on these overinflated 9 million, and they were all women, and that's kind of a bit of a politicized narrative, which I don't think is particularly helpful, because I think 50,000 executions is bad enough. So I don't think we really need to sort of talk about those really inflated figures.
I get your point. How were people executed? Were they always burned at the stake? I think that's also from the movie In the Name of the Rose, where they tie you to the stake, and unless you recant and kiss the cross that's offered, you're going to get burned alive.
Yeah.
I mean, it's horrific.
Yeah. Most people are burnt at the stake. Most people are killed first. They are strangled. Usually, it wasn't always the case. Some people sadly were burnt alive. That was the sort of the punishment for heresy. So, and some other crimes as well. So, for example, you would also have, sadly, at the same time, particularly in the 16th century, there were also executions for heresy where people were burnt at the stake. But that was another pressure on people, that they would be told that if they confessed and kind of made their peace with God, they would be shown the mercy, and I'm doing the thing again with my fingers, the mercy of being strangled first. So again, if you think about the psychological pressure, facing you with that sort of choice, that's another reason why people confess. In England and in the English colonies, witchcraft was defined slightly differently. It was defined not as a religious, not so much as a heresy, but as a felony. And so in England and New England, you could be, if you were convicted of harmful witchcraft, you would be hanged. So the mode of execution is slightly different in England and New England. Most, I would say, I mean, again, we don't have exact data, but kind of most people would probably have been strangled before execution as a mercy, as a supposed mercy.
What sort of people were usually, if we can even generalize in such a manner, what sort of people were usually accused of being witches? You said that the majority of them were women, at least in the early modern period.
Yeah.
I'm assuming, but you mentioned also that rich man from Bamberg. But I'm still assuming most of them probably weren't rich people, were peasants with a weaker social network or social support, older women, or am I totally wrong here?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think that the gendering of it is very important. So overall, somewhere like 75 to 80% of all the accused and all those executed were women. So it's a very profoundly gendered phenomenon against women. But that also just reminds us that it was possible also to be accused and executed if you were a man. Again, there's a lot of regional variation on the gendering. So, for example, in Bamberg, the reason somebody like a wealthier man could get dragged into the trials is because they are so extremely severe. I mean, once you start torturing people and asking them to denounce people, people can begin to imagine anybody being a witch, anybody being at this witches' gathering. So part of the dragging in of male suspects is due to that very large, in those cases, a very large-scale escalation of accusation through denunciation that makes it possible to drag men in. And you can see that in some of the imagery of the time. You see images, so artists and demonologists and printers, they're kind of imagining what did the witches' gathering look like, and you can see them. There are men at the witches' gathering as well as women. So once you get into that sort of imaginative world, which they believed in, you can incorporate male figures into that Sabbath. But no, the vast majority are women. The vast majority are sort of peasant women, but then most people in early modern Europe are peasants anyway. So they're not beggars for the most part. They're not vagrants. They're usually adult women who are married or have been married. So it's not necessarily they're always targeting sort of single women or widows. It's almost always or very often women who are married or at least have been married. Women very often of middling years. Sometimes much older women get accused, and it's often the case that they've had a reputation for some time beforehand. So they might be accused in their 60s or 70s, but they might have had a reputation. There might have been a suspicion for much longer that they were witches. And again, it's very, very difficult to generalize, but it seems to be the case that women who were particularly sort of quarrelsome, verbally aggressive, argumentative, perhaps feisty, if you like, women who perhaps cursed or scolded or were a bit interfering. So I think women who were perhaps a bit verbally, we might see them today as verbally confident and verbally articulate, but that was sort of coded as quite a negative and threatening way of behaving then. Women who perhaps interfered too much in their neighbours' houses, in their neighbours' lives. And quite often, I think the really sad thing about some of these cases is that it's quite often other women accusing these female neighbours of witchcraft. So it's women accusers who, perhaps whose child has fallen sick, who have had a miscarriage, who's, dairy making, that, they're trying to churn butter and it's not working. And very, very sadly, one way in which they might manage their own kind of anxiety or fear or sense of failure about themselves as a wife and a mother, one way they might do that was by kind of projecting that onto another female neighbour that they imagined as having caused that problem or that misfortune. So when you dig into sort of the village level, if you like, the village level tensions and accusations, it's quite sad, I think, that you quite often see some of these accusations coming out of these areas of sort of female interaction, female activity, childbearing, household management, food production, and so on. And it's women actually fearful and of other women and accusing them of being witches. I think when women get taken to court, obviously that looks much more like, the patriarchal legal system prosecuting them, but quite often the initial accusation is voiced by another woman in the community.
It's fascinating how we're coming back to this sort of conspiracy mindset. I interviewed a journalist who's researching conspiracy theories in the United States. He wrote a famous book about the QAnon conspiracy theory. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's really crazy. But he said something similar about people who believe in it. He said that it's usually people who experience some sort of a trauma or a tragedy in their family, and that's the only way that they can sort of process it, is to find some sort of cabal of hidden forces that are to blame for it.
Yeah. I think it's absolutely crucial to think about, what situation were people in, what were their lives like, kind of what was going on inside their heads. I think there are a lot of similarities, sadly, between what some of the emotional psychological processes that were going on in the early modern period are actually very similar to some of the conspiracy theory, some of the conspiracy theories that we have today. So although when we look at some of this witchcraft material, we're puzzled by it or we laugh at it, but I think some of the fundamental processes of scapegoating people, of projecting feelings of or ways of coping with trauma, projecting them onto other people, blaming other people for them, I think a lot of that is still, sadly, very, very relevant today, even though the beliefs might be very different. So I think, there are people who, if you're an early modern woman and your child has died, it's quite difficult. You could say, it's my fault, I'm to blame, I'm a bad mother. you could say it's God's will, and obviously most people tended to explain misfortune in that way. They would assume that it was part of God's divine plan and try and cope with it through religion and prayer. So it's not that everybody was immediately thinking it was witchcraft. There are that's bad luck. There are other ways of explaining misfortune, but for some people, they would process it by blaming somebody else. It was a way of perhaps of relieving their own sense of anxiety, sense of guilt, and it also gave them something to do about it. If you're feeling quite powerless,
a sense of agency.
Yeah, I can accuse someone. I can, perhaps go to a white witch about them. I can take some action. So I think it's about the emotional and psychological way of managing trauma and loss.
This is exactly what Mike Rothschild, that journalist, said, that it gives people a sense of agency, that they can do something about it. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
You alluded to this earlier. In, I believe, 1486, some German dude, some clergyman, published a treatise on how to spot and persecute witches.
Mm-hmm.
The book was called Maleus. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I like the idea of him being a German dude. Yeah, Heinrich Kramer. Yeah, yeah. He's actually one of the Dominican inquisitors. He was from Germany, so you're absolutely right. He gave himself the much more highfalutin name of Instatoris, though, because that was what he did.
Instatoris, what is that?
Well, it's a Latin. He took on a Latin. Lots of early modern learned men, to give themselves more kind of claims to authority, I think, give themselves Latin surnames. So, but his name was Heinrich Kramer or Kramer. Yeah, I mean, the Malleus Maleficarum, it means the hammer of witches in English. So in a way, it was part of that process I talked about earlier, this 15th century development of this new idea of the witch as a heretic. Kramer kind of comes at the end of that process. He's a Dominican inquisitor. He's gone into Germany to try and fight heresy, and he thinks, he's finding witches. The difference in his case is he writes a text about it, and it's the first text about witchcraft to go into print. So I think that's where we see the importance of the print technology. So there had been earlier kind of manuscript texts written by inquisitors, but his is the first one that actually goes into print. And I mean, it's one of many demonologies. The early modern period, because this is seen as
demonology.
Yeah, it's called a demonology. It's a genre of writing. It's a genre of writing about demons and witches and the devil.
And it was considered non-fiction.
Non-fiction, yeah.
Okay.
Some of the most learned minds of the early modern period write demonologies. So the French political theorist Jean Baudin writes a demonology. The King of England and Scotland, James the First and Sixth, writes a demonology, because it's such a contemporary topic. It's new, it's important, it's exciting, it's people debate it in print. So there are lots of these demonologies. So I think sometimes the Malleus kind of it kind of gets a bit overemphasized because it's one of many. And the other important thing is, although the vast majority, really until about the 17th century, are very much in favor of witch persecution, there are, even in the 16th century, a couple of sort of brave souls who go into print saying, what a daft idea. I mean, they put it, more learnedly than that. But so the weight of opinion until probably about the late 17th century is very much in favor of witch hunting. But even in the 16th and early 17th century, you occasionally get demonologists who are willing to say, this is a really bad idea. And we so again, I think we just, the opinion is a little bit more divided perhaps than people think. But the Malleus is a really interesting text. The reason Kramer wrote it, I think, is because he had failed. He tried to start a witch hunt in his activities as an inquisitor. So he's sent by the Pope from Italy to Germany. He's trying to whip up anxiety about witches. He's trying to get people prosecuted. He's trying to get women executed. And the local authorities just say no. They say, what a weird idea. Who is this? And also they don't like the idea that this outsider is telling them what they should be doing, how they should be, pursuing heretics. So Kramer is essentially a failed witch hunter. He fails. He is not supported by local authorities. He is not. His ideas about witches having sex with demons. People. I think honestly, they think he's almost kind of mad and almost sort of mentally unstable. And they find he's interested. He asks women who they've had sex with and things like that. Local people find this really, really problematic. So he's a failed witch hunter, but it's on the back of that failure that he writes the Malleus. So he kind of all his resentment and all his anger and all his misogyny is kind of poured out into that book. I think there are a couple of really interesting things about it. He doesn't say anything that new about witches, really, apart from he really emphasizes that they're more
sounds like a angry incel with a pen.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, very much. Yeah, he's Dominican. He's not, he doesn't marry. He doesn't have. So he really emphasizes that witches are women and that they make sexual pacts. So that becomes much more foregrounded in his writing. And the other really important thing he does is he says witchcraft is a really serious crime, so secular courts really need to take up the fight against it. So in a way, one of his most sort of important influences, I think, over time is partly the strengthening the gendering of the persecution, but also saying secular courts need to take the fight up, and also that they should treat witchcraft as an exceptional crime. In other words, it's so terrible that they should do whatever they can to fight witches. So although he is an inquisitor, because he's sort of failed in his inquisitorial work as he sees it, and one of his main opponents was a local bishop. So I think he feels the church isn't doing a good enough job, if you like, and therefore it's secular courts that should take up the work. So it's a very important demonology, but there are others. There are later demonologies which sort of replace it almost as not that they're any more or less misogynistic or whatever. It's just that because this is a very current, important topic, people carry on writing about it, debating about it, adding to it, developing ideas. So it's kind of a really important starting point for those demonological debates that carry on.
We think of the Renaissance as this great awakening from this dark, long slumber of the medieval period. The scientific inquiry is coming to the forefront. And what impact did the Renaissance have on witch hunts?
I think it has an impact. If any. I think it has an impact insofar as it really it reawakens interest in magic, in natural magic, in Platonic magic, but that's a very, very kind of male elite. We're talking about a really kind of, there's the only men who can read, Greek, Latin, Hebrew. We're talking about a very kind of elite group of men. So there was always the possibility for men to practice that kind of level of elite magic. It could be risky, but it could also, gain them positions of power. And if you think about, John Dee, he was the sort of the court astrologer stroke magician in the
of Queen Elizabeth, right?
Yeah, in the court of Elizabeth I. So I think the Renaissance really, in the same way that it kind of, reignited religious interest in ancient texts, it kind of reignites this sort of real interest in old Hermetic and natural and sort of Platonic magical texts. I think insofar as it has any impact on witch persecution, I think the problem there is that because the Reformation begins to happen in the early 16th century. So I think you have kind of got a Renaissance moment, if you like, where things could have perhaps gone differently. Things might have gone differently had it not been for the Little Ice Age and the Reformation. I mean, I think the Reformation, what the Reformation does, sadly, from the sort of 1520s onwards, is it causes huge religious division, religious tension, religious war, and religious persecution. So because you've got massive religious division in Europe, that really feeds the sorts of anxieties and concerns about heresy that sort of encourage people to prosecute witches. And people at that time, that they could imagine so many different sorts of magical practitioners. So they could imagine an old woman in league with the devil who needed prosecuting, and an elite necromancer who was working at the local court. So I think, again, they've got a very kind of rich sort of number of potential magical practitioners. They'd also have a white witch in the next village who they'd go to for help. So they could imagine, I mean, early modern people are very, very kind of capable of imagining all sorts of different magical practitioners, and you wouldn't necessarily go to law or try and accuse all of them. So I think the Renaissance, I think it's a moment where things could have gone differently, but I think because of those other things that happen, and I think particularly the Reformation, the religious division, the anxiety that causes, and sadly I think religious zeal, people convinced of their own godliness, determined to discipline or get rid of people who don't, subscribe to their level of godly zeal. I think that's a really dangerous thing as well. And when you get that kind of combined with a Little Ice Age, a legal system that allows for prosecution, I think that's, and a patriarchal system, which obviously puts women in much more risk of prosecution. I think that's a really toxic sort of mixture that, but as I say, it's not happening to the same extent absolutely everywhere, which I know isn't much comfort, but it's probably just worth mentioning at least.
We have to wrap up, but I just wanted to ask you this at the end. Why did the public opinion finally turn against witch persecution?
It turns against witch persecution largely because the educated elites stopped taking it seriously. So actually, belief in magic and belief in witchcraft.
So kind of top down.
Yeah. I mean, we've got this case from Essex in 1863. There's a village in Essex.
Like 150 years ago.
Yeah. A man was swum, allegedly, because people thought he had harmed someone through magic in 1863 in Sibylhedingham in Essex. It's, as far as I know, the last known witch swimming that happened in England. So
witch swimming.
Yeah. So the idea well, not just in England, in parts of Europe as well, was the idea that if you tied somebody up and put them into water, a pond,
if they float,
yeah, if they sink, they're innocent but might drown. If they float, they are guilty. But very often,
fantastic.
Yeah, very often people actually put sort of a rope around them. So it was, again, we're not talking objective tests here. You could kind of manage it by what you did with the rope. So anyway, 1863. So popular belief continues a great deal longer than we might think. For quite a long time after trials end, people still believe in magic and they still believe in witchcraft. What we get from the really late 17th, but primarily the 18th century, the educated elites who in the 15th century had kind of bought into this idea, by the late 17th, but really the 18th century, they begin to change their minds. They begin to become less willing to believe that supernatural intervention of the devil, of witches, and that is to do, I think some of the ideas, Zaza, that you mentioned earlier in relation to the Renaissance, they're really more a feature of the kind of 18th century Enlightenment, the idea that the universe works on more rational principles.
Right.
And I think there's also a kind of a degree of sort of snobbery about it. The educated men start thinking, well, witchcraft, that's what peasants believe, that's what children, old wives' tales. It kind of becomes, in the minds of the elites, I think, the educated, particularly the secular elites, they begin to find witchcraft belief a lot more problematic. So in the 18th century, you begin to see the laws that had allowed the persecutions, you begin to see them being repealed or being changed. So in England, in Britain, for example, in the 1730s, the old laws against witchcraft are repealed. But there's a new law which says anybody who claims to practice magic or witchcraft can be prosecuted as a fraud. So you can kind of really, really see in a really kind of clear example that shift of emphasis. So witchcraft isn't real. It's an illusion and it's a fraud. But in many ways, they're kind of going back to the earlier medieval ideas. So but it's becoming enshrined at law. So technically after that, you could prosecute magical practitioners for fraud if you wanted to. But that's a really kind of clear marker of this change.
Instead of being accused of having sex with the devil, you're more relegated to being more of a scammer then, and a swindler.
Yeah, getting things under false pretenses. So So, but it's a really interesting recategorization of magical practice, and that's a really kind of top down initiative. But as I say, ordinary people carry on. Beliefs aren't going to change at that level for longer, and it's a slower process.
Are there still beliefs in witches somewhere in the world at the moment?
Oh yeah. No,
there are?
Well, I mean, it depends what you mean by witch. I think, one problem with English is it's not got a very big vocabulary. So for witch, and we assume it's female. But as I say, in German and, in other languages, you'd have more gender differentiation. So, I mean, in England today, in Europe today, in America today, there are lots of people, particularly women, neo-pagans who self-identify as witches. And sadly, in many parts of the world, so for example, Papua New Guinea, parts of India, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, many of these beliefs, but also sadly many of these sort of acts of violence and persecution against alleged witches, they're still going on. So what I've been talking about today is very much a kind of Western European story. So I mean, I've just actually been at a conference where one of the papers was about the witchcraft in Ghana, and the speaker was talking about
contemporary,
yeah. And what they've done in some parts of Ghana is set up kind of witch villages. So people accused, women, and it's almost entirely women, accused of witchcraft, that they can actually seek refuge there, or they're kind of exiled there. So to avoid some of the extreme kind of violence, that they then go and live in these sort of almost like kind of witch camps, if you like. So no, it was a very, very sort of salutary reminder, really, that just because we sort of think of it as being a past phenomenon, that, it's not to say that it isn't going on in other parts of the world today. I mean, there are sort of different contextualizing reasons for it, but certainly, unfortunately, there is still a lot of violence against suspected witches and belief in their potentially magical powers.
Professor Rowlands, thank you so much for taking the time. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too.
I hope at the end, I hope you don't mind that at the end I ask you something a little bit more silly.
Okay.
Despite studying this quite tragic, often sad part of history, can you still enjoy Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings?
I can.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm really interested, apart from anything else, in how these long-standing beliefs are still very much part of our culture. They're in a very different part of our culture. I mean, they're interestingly, particularly in Western Europe and the UK, they're very much in children's literature nowadays. But it's really interesting to see the historical literary journey by which that sort of change has happened. So yeah, but I absolutely love reading anyway, and I love reading. It was a brilliant thing to read to your kids as well when they were little. So yeah, I do still enjoy it. But it's funny. I sometimes when I'm watching the films, particularly, I look at the Quidditch scenes, and I think, the first Witch on a Broomstick that I know of was from a mid 15th century manuscript, and I kind of think you can kind of see the way that image of the magical flying has come all the way from the Middle Ages into Quidditch. So that's quite interesting from a historical point of view to look at that. And it's quite a great way as well, if you're teaching this or talking to school children about it, it can be a really nice kind of way into some of these ideas, because they're going to immediately have a kind of a connection to it from the literature.
Right. And from villains to absolute heroes now.
Yeah. Well, you say that, but I mean, Harry Potter is really about the battle, isn't it, between good and bad magic? You've got your good wizards,
You're right.
Fighting the
Voldemort.
So in a way, I mean, what it doesn't have is that kind of overlay of heresy. There's no devil, there's no kind of Christian framework, but it's fundamentally about using magical powers for good or using them for evil. So I suppose in that sense, it's still got that idea of the two possibilities of magic.
Professor Rowlands, thank you so much. Do you have any social media? Where can people follow your work?
I'm not very technologically good on social media. We have a Twitter account, an X account in our School of Philosophical, Historical and Interdisciplinary Studies. So I tend to post sort of news about conferences and things through our school media network.
So University of Essex,
yes,
Twitter
University
account?
of Essex, yeah.
Okay, we'll include that
Brilliant.
below the YouTube video. Again, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Great, thanks, Azza. Glad it worked out.
Hey, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard, please consider subscribing and following Smart Cookies on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And if you really liked what you heard, feel free to go on and become my benefactor on Patreon. So I'll be able to keep having these awesome conversations with really, really smart folks. Which brings me to my existing patrons, in effect producers of this podcast, a set of absolute legends without whom Smart Cookies would not exist in the first place. My immense gratitude goes to Miha Medved, Medinho, Gordan, Lorenzo, Mila, Veronica, Teja, Jurechuk, Goran, and Carmen. Your support means everything, so thank you.